Brian Shreck. I'm a postdoc in the Political Science Department at the National Wind Institute. What I'm presenting here today is sort of a piece of a continuing collaboration between myself and Arnie Bedlitz, who's the director of the Institute for Science, Technology, and Public Policy in the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M. And this is adapted from a paper that we have forthcoming in Society and Natural Resources. And so basically the central question that we're interested in here is kind of traces back to a very old but still very much unsettled debate in political science. And it traces its roots really back to the famous Dewey-Lippmann debate of the early 20th century, where Lippmann wrote the book The Phantom Public, in which he essentially lambasted the idea that democratic self-rule is even possible because the public, and in this case specifically the American public, just simply isn't smart enough or engaged enough to become an expert on all the issues that they would need to become an expert on in order to make informed decisions about complex policy issues. And then Dewey comes along later and says that basically the technocracy that Lippmann's theory leads us to is not desirable, because when decisions are made by the few, they're generally made in the interest of the few. And he also says that we don't need this sort of omniscient citizen. What we need is basically a public that is reasonably well educated and reasonably engaged, that is informed by but not ruled by science and technical experts. And then they need to sort of debate and deliberate about problems and solutions, and they'll generally arrive at the right answer or something close to it. And even though Dewey and Lippmann couldn't have possibly foreseen our contemporary climate debate from their position in the early 20th century, it is actually tailor-made to sort of the exact type of problem that they're talking about. It's a scientifically complicated issue that a lot of people don't understand very well. There are right and wrong answers, and the stakes of getting it wrong are very high. And so this debate has sort of spawned this this paradigm in democratic theory, this deliberative democratic theory paradigm, whereby a lot of people sort of argue that deliberation ought to be the sort of cornerstone of democratic legitimacy. So, but we don't know much about sort of deliberation over the specific issue of climate change. There is a lot of really good data out there and good scholarship out there on public opinion and beliefs about climate change. Probably most prominently, Anthony Lazarowitz and his colleagues in the Yale project on climate change communication are doing some really interesting research. And they essentially split the American public into 6 segments based on level of belief and level of concern about global warming. So all the way from the alarmed over here on this end of the spectrum that are the highest believing in global warming and the most concerned, to the dismissive over here, which are the least concerned and least believing, which makes sense because why would they be concerned about something they don't believe is real? And so they've identified this interesting but perhaps not surprising relationship, this sort of V-shaped relationship between civic engagement and these levels of belief in climate change. So the people at the polls here, the alarmed and the dismissive, the most believing and the least believing in climate change are actually the most engaged on the issue. And then you have this sort of vast in between of people who are less engaged or even completely disengaged. And this is a pattern that a lot of people, but especially proponents of deliberative democracy, have pointed to and said, this is a problem. We need to be talking about these issues more. And we need to be engaging on these issues more. But this is a debate that has largely taken place in the realm of theoretical, and there's not a lot of empirical work on this. So it's not exactly clear what that would look like if we actually started talking about these things more. And it's not clear, for example, it's not obvious that what we would see is any sort of emerging consensus on climate change. What seems just as likely, or perhaps even more likely, is that we would end up with these sort of two echo chambers on either end of the spectrum. So this is the question that we set out to try to bring some insight into. So we put our own survey in the field and we asked people about a myriad of things with regard to their opinions and beliefs about climate change, their knowledge about climate change, and most importantly for this particular paper, their engagement in discussion about climate change with the people around them, specifically family, friends, and coworkers. So we measure levels of engagement in discussion about climate change. We measure knowledge about climate change in a couple of different ways. I'll show you that in the next slide here. So one of the first things we were interested in is thinking about or finding out who is actually talking about climate change and how much do they know about it. So when we measure knowledge objectively by asking people fact-based questions about climate change, and we map that against their engagement in discussion about climate change, we see is basically a pretty flat line. So it's kind of a mix of people, from people who know very little about the subject to people who know a lot about the subject and sort of everywhere in between. But when we look at people's self-assessed knowledge, so we just simply ask people to rate how much they know about climate change on an 11-point scale, from not at all informed to very well informed, we see a much more interesting pattern whereby people who think they know a lot are the ones engaging the most in discussion about climate change. And so their sort of behavior on this issue has a lot more to do with what they think they know than with what they actually know. And this becomes a sort of consistent pattern throughout the data. So the next thing we wanted to do is identify the covariance of belief in climate change and opinion about various policy questions with regard to how we should respond to climate change. So we're, on the left here, we're looking at basically belief in anthropogenic climate change. Do you believe that global warming is caused by human activities? Mapped against partisanship. Here we have a sort of basic question about, in this case, a question about imposing a tax on industry to combat practices that contribute to climate change. We asked a whole bunch of different policy questions like this. I chose this one. The responses to them all looked a lot the same, basically. So I'm just showing one here. So we can see that it's polarized, right? We see that it's a very partisan issue. We knew that, right? We didn't need a new survey to tell us that. So the challenge then is sort of figuring out what's left. What's left in the variation that we can explain what other patterns we can identify here.
Brian?
Yes?
Could you focus that last slide a little better and read those bottoms?
Oh, sure.
Because
yeah,
it's really not focused very well, very fuzzy. So.
Okay, I don't know how to focus it better, but I can read them to you. So they're the same on both graphs. The one on the far left here is strong Republican. These are self-identified party identifications. And then basically weak Republican, leans Republican, undecided, independent, or other, leans Democrat, strong Democrat, or weak Democrat, and strong Democrat. Okay. So the next thing we looked at was knowledge and the relationship between knowledge and both belief and opinion on climate change. So we have knowledge on the y-axis here, on the left graph, and on the bottom, we have the same question there about do you agree or disagree with the statement that global warming is caused by human activities. So we have from strongly disagree to strongly agree over here. And we see sort of a pattern emerge, kind of a V-shaped pattern, but it's kind of irregular, and the confidence bands are large because of that sort of mix of people that are talking about this. And so we can't really tell much from this graph. And so on this graph on the right-hand side, we have the self-assessed knowledge question. How much do you think you know? And then the same question on the bottom here, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And we see a much tighter, much more defined sort of V-shaped relationship. So people who rate themselves as the most knowledgeable are the ones who are basically have the strongest beliefs on both ends of the spectrum here on whether or not they believe in human-caused climate change. This is essentially the same thing on the question about imposing a tax on industry. So I'll pass over that one. But then when we look at people's actual engagement in public discussion about climate change and the relationship between that and belief and opinion, we see some interesting patterns begin to unfold. So on the left here we have the question about, do you believe in climate change, against how much people actually engaged in discussion about climate change. And we see sort of a U-shaped form here, but this relationship actually over here on the left, on the strongly disagree side, is actually not significant. And so it's actually only significant on the strongly agree side. So the people who are talking most about climate change are the people who strongly believe in it already. So what this suggests is maybe that we are starting to see some sort of emerging consensus about the existence or the reality of anthropogenic climate change. But then when we look at the graph on the right, where we're looking at policy preferences on this particular question, we see a much stronger U-shaped relationship here that is actually significant on both ends of the spectrum. So the people who have the strongest opinions opposing and supporting this particular policy alternative are both engaging in higher amounts of discussion on the issue. So what this would suggest is that even though we might see some sort of emerging consensus about the reality of climate change, we'll still probably be divided and polarized about what to do about it, which is not particularly surprising. Okay, I guess that's it. So I'll end there and take questions. That was about it.
Okay, so go back to the very first one about knowledge, self-reporting. Yeah. But you guys ever break that out between, between the across the political spectrum? In other words, are Democrats more self-obsessed knowledge than Republicans?
Yeah, I think we looked at that. I don't think we found any relationship there. There's overconfidence on both sides. That's jazz, right? It's just one party more overconfident. Right. Yeah. I don't think there was. I could go back and look at that, but I don't think there was.
What does that say?
So basically, you have level of knowledge here on the x-axis on the bottom, and engagement in public discussion about climate change on the top. And so basically, the fact that the line is completely flat. So basically, it's saying that among the people who are talking about climate change, they're not predominantly more knowledgeable people or less knowledgeable. Right? It's a mixture of people who know very little and people who know a lot. So that's basically what that's saying.
What is the vertical axis representing there?
That's our measure of public discourse or public discussion. So the way we measured that was actually we had a series of questions on the survey that asked people about different scenarios and different groups of people that they have engaged with about climate change, and we just created a simple additive index. So there were total possible 12 affirmative responses there. So it's a scale of 0 to 12. And I should have truncated this graph at the 0 there, because the reason that confidence band is so huge on 0 and actually on the scales is because there is no 0 observed in the data set. Everybody got at least one question.
So sir, for the next graph, so you have two people with the same knowledge, but they agree or disagree. So that's because of their beliefs, maybe, right? So I mean, the beliefs are more important than the knowledge. So that's what's trying to say from the graph.
Beliefs are more important than the knowledge.
I mean, they have the same knowledge, but still they agree or disagree. So knowledge doesn't matter much. Maybe.
I'm sorry. I'm not
It's
sure.
that. I think the next graph. No. Yes.
Okay.
So for example, on the left, so they have the same knowledge still. Some of them strongly agree, and some strongly disagree, right?
Mhm.
So what's the other factor influencing them? It's the beliefs, right?
Yeah. So the belief is on the bottom axis here, the x-axis. So, you mean the other factors influencing whether they agree or disagree?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, good question. I think I know where you're going. So I'm presenting just some simple kind of bivariate relationships here for the purposes of this presentation. In the paper, we have much fuller models where we control for lots of other things. So we're controlling for partisanship, we're controlling for education level, we're controlling for all sorts of demographic factors, income, things of that nature, economic perceptions, and all sorts of things. So we have full models, but I'm not showing you them here. But the relationships that I'm showing you here do hold significant in full models.
I'm actually very curious in those demographic and socioeconomic and gender factors. Do we see those playing into this knowledge and belief in public discourse?
Not as much as you might think, actually. And I don't have the full model with me, and I don't remember off the top of my head, but most of those demographic factors turn up significant only sporadically, not very strongly.
This kind of is going off of what this gentleman was saying. When it comes to the knowledge, have y'all done any surveys on like where they're getting their quote unquote knowledge? I mean, is it that some people are getting their knowledge from Fox News and some are getting their knowledge from Scientific American, but they value that knowledge similarly, and so they think they're as knowledgeable, but
Yeah, we didn't incorporate that into this particular paper, but we do have in these surveys questions that ask people where they get their information from on climate change or energy issues. We don't quite break it down as fine-grained as like Fox News versus CNN versus MSNBC because we have to keep the surveys sort of manageably short so that people can take them in a timely manner. But we do ask, cable news versus newspapers versus internet sources, things like that. So we might be able to get some leverage on that.
I wonder how that applies to your question about beliefs, or is it like that they think that they're the same knowledge, that they're equal in knowledgeability, but that they're very different knowledge sources?
Yeah.
But your measure of knowledge there, you have a sort of that self-assess where you ask them how much do you think you know,
Right.
and then you check to see how many answers they got right on the 12 or 13 questions. That's how the level is measured.
We have to stop here.
Yes.
Please hang around and talk more, but the class is about